here with us, but my focus is a little bit different than most of the employees and workforce members at Optiv. I'm focused on protecting Optiv as a corporation. So I'm the Director of Information Security at Optiv. I get to play with all the fun technology and tools, integrate in people, process, and technology. And a couple of the areas I'm focused on is identity access management, but also cybersecurity incident response. So we're going to talk a little bit about how those typically two different silos start to intertwine and the importance of each one of them. And instead of treating them as two separate things, let's treat them as one. So if you think about it, our problem, right? Our threat landscape continues to change every day. And part of that is the factor that our security programs still keep those and treat them as completely separate. And we've got common challenges that are part of that, right? And you have to understand the clear understanding of threats. You've got to understand defenses can lag behind your different threat models that are there. And you've got to be able, as a business unit, balance risk. And the first section you really have to be able to focus on is, what are your threat mappings? How do you analyze that? How do you look at that data differently than what you do today? Because when you look at programs from an identity access management silo or an incident response silo, people are looking at different types of data. But actually, in reality, your SOC analysts are looking at something that's very similar. Now, from the defenses that lag behind an attack, think about it from the dwell time side of things. The number of days between somebody's breached and the amount of time that it's detected. The number of companies that learn about a breach from Krebs on security, right? From MSN, from other media outlets. And then where those are actually coming from, no matter if they're customers, identities, internal workforce members, commercial products, devices that may be interjected into your landscape and portfolio. So from an information security perspective, and what we've realized is, like you guys have heard from many of the presentations, our boundaries itself are actually disappearing. More and more corporations are going towards a cloud computing environment. Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. And why are they doing that? Well, they're getting better service out of those providers than they are the IT function. But what's that do to us as an information security team? Now, the actors that are located around the world, they don't care really where your infrastructure or your platform or your software is actually maintained. They're looking at you as a conglomerate organization that has data in which they want, that they can use for financial gain. Now, the risk and adjusted returns associated with launching those attacks have actually drastically decreased, right? You've got sovereign nations. You've got Eric Snowden, who went to Russia and has asylum, right? So there's a known pattern in which they can actually get by with this, right? In healthcare space today, how many times has an organization came forward here recently and they've had some type of crypto blocker or ransomware that's actually been put on devices that's basically left that business to be unusable, and the organizations are paying that amount of funds to reduce the risk to their business unit. And they believe it's a victimless crime at that point. That's why they're going after it. They don't understand what the business impact is. So your intruders and your threats are actually going after that. Now, there's multiple different methods of attack, and those attack mechanisms and vectors continue to change. Those are our realities in the cybersecurity space. And it's been that way for quite some period of time. And if you look at what we have to protect, every security problem that's out there, right? There's advanced threats, there's cloud infrastructure servers, there's mobility, there's third-party risk, evolving technology landscapes. You've got your insider threats and behavior analysis that continues to come up. But think about it in the future, right? Some of the top 2016 security trends, have you thought about 3D printing as a risk? Your intellectual property walking out the door about this new pacemaker maybe that you're creating? Have you thought about what information security risk and concerns are to your data when you start to look at big data technology to maybe do financial transactions, look at healthcare data differently? Have you removed that personal identifiable information or that payment card industry information away from that? Have you looked at the aspect of mobile applications and the Internet of Things? More and more cars are being connected out to the cloud. You've got Salesforce that becomes a platform of actually sending health checks and alerts out into the cloud. Well, that's not behind your firewall. That's not behind your perimeter. And we've, as an organization and industry from a security perspective, have always focused on building that outer shell and focused on the outer shell, but we haven't been as focused on the cloud computing aspect. If you look at the information that's out there, about 90 different cloud providers are being leveraged inside of your environment at any date and time. Now, how much visibility do you actually have into that? And what does that mean to the data set that you're trying to protect? Are you aware of it? And how does that look at it from an incident response? And are you aware of it from that asset classification and knowing the inventory of where that data lives? And what does that mean from identity access management perspective? Authentication, authorization, privilege management, the identity that has access to that data. And it really starts to bring in a lot of different questions in that security landscape. Now, as practitioners, we always focus on people, process, and technology. But people, process, and technology by itself starts to break down the barriers in between each one of the silos. You have your typical management and planning solutions that are out there. You've got typically today your monitoring and operations or security operations teams. You've got the teams that are focused on architecture, engineering, your security solutions, and coming up with, well, what is that next best generation endpoint and solution that may be out there? And then you've got all your different defensive controls that are out there on servers, workstations, your network perimeter, inside your apps, your data. But how often do they actually collaborate about identity access management and incident response? Because the very first thing that typically that gets asked as you're going into incident response is, well, who had access to that? Where did that start from? But today, we're more like early medicine. We have a whole team of people that are sitting around the patient at the moment, the data breach that is occurring, and we're all taking different shots at, well, what actually occurred. And it's tough to actually get and understand what the diagnosis is for that patient by doing that. Yes, we're collaborating, but we don't have a lot of anecdotal and scientific data that's behind the scenes to understand what's actually occurring because we're not sharing information from the threat intelligence space around identity access management. So if we look at dwell time as an example, Mandiant recently on February 17th came out with a report that said an APT actually maintained access for 356 days inside of an environment, right? But the attackers actually had 205 days worth of time in which they had free reign inside the environment, meaning the security team never was aware. Now think about the amount of damage that could occur in that amount of time. Think if you were a patient, right? A lot of times dwell time, I always link back to the healthcare environment or a financial system. If you were able to have some type of virus that was in your body for a long period of time, 205 days, without you going to the doctor, right, and get checked on your annual checkups, that's pretty significant. It could really cause major harm to your body. Well, that's why a lot of these organizations are actually getting in trouble, right? It's the amount of dwell time that was there. That's why all the GRC controls are actually being put in place from a risk and compliance perspective is people aren't doing the right things from the detective perspective. So that brings up the strategy and innovation, right? How do we start to think differently, share information that goes back and forth, and how can we, from a consumer perspective and in a business perspective, actually provide information into that? So some people are probably aware of this from a military background, but the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act. And if you can do that faster than what your attacker does that, you'll win. Think about it from a military background, right? You're going to observe what is going on in the endpoint. You're going to orient yourself what is going on. You're going to decide what to do, and then you're going to take an action. Well, the attackers are doing the same thing, except when they observe, They orient themselves about your network, your environment, the IP address space, what privileges you have on that box, don't have on that box, what authorization you have on that machine, what access to data you have on that machine, and then they decide, which is actually a pivot, right? They're deciding what to do next, and then they take that next action. Now that pivot may be taking data that's on the system that you have in front of you, or that pivot may be compromising another host. But if we look at things from today's perspective, what majority of the organizations are doing, the security guys go, oh no, I believe we have an issue, right? Starts off with an email. Almost the majority of the corporations are probably working in this fashion today. And then you get asked, well, what do we know about that asset, right? What do we know about that environment? Can we scan it? Do we even know we have that asset? Do we know what data is on that asset? IT many times goes, oh no, it's compromised, it's unsuccessful, we can't clean it, we can't get rid of it, whatever it may be, malicious malware, something that's never been seen by the antivirus software companies that are there. Finally, figure out who the owner of the host is. Identity, right? First letter. Who owns it? Who has access? Has access to financial data. We want IT to collect it. Now we've got an inventory problem, right? We've got to maintain custody of that device. IT support goes out and collects it. They get a copy of the image. That now also becomes another artifact that you've got to collect and maintain. Legal and compliance wants to know, what's the sensitivity of the financial data that was lost? It was the CFO's laptop, right? Was it PCI information? Was it the next quarter earnings? Was it some new intellectual property that was going to get released and we're a publicly traded company? Is it something SOX related? Is it going to impact our stock price? Legal, of course, is worried about the need to know the exact nature of the stolen information. So you're starting to link the aspect of identity back to the data associated with the incident response that's actually occurring. And then, depending on the nature of the incident, you've got an FBI case that you may be actually consulting with. And they, of course, are going to want to know, the specific data that was stolen and what do you need from them. And they're going to want to know exactly the data. Now, in most cases for incident response today, a lot of people are just storing that in an Excel spreadsheet. That's a lot of communication to go back and forth, right? Think about all the different email messages that are getting forwarded. You've got to maintain chain of custody for every aspect of that, which means you have to know the identity of the person that you're sending it to. You've got to make sure that that message can't be compromised as it's being sent. You've got the right authorization. You've got the right cryptography that's built into place, which really causes a lot of issues. Now, if we pivot for a second and we look at this from a threat perspective, threats are there to basically, the definition is the intention to inflict pain, injury, or damage, or other hostile action on someone in retribution. Now that can be a person, individually, that could be a company, but those threats that we're aware of continue to change. So if we look at who actually typically causes these types of threats and who's actually out there, think about the type of person that typically is looking at this from an insider perspective. You've got threats that are insiders, people who want to look at from a competition perspective, your hacktivists, your reputation people. But each one of these groups, right, they're looking at it from a curiosity perspective. That's why they're doing it, right? In general. That's the mindset of the typical hacker and attacker that's out there. Now, we talked about dwell time for a little bit. All of these were public hacks that actually got introduced. But there's many, many more hacks that occur every day, but they're not under some type of regulation to actually get disclosed. And what the estimate is at this point is there's 50 times more incidents that actually occur that never get disclosed out into the environment, that never get released on CRIPS, that never get released back up into the federal government because it doesn't contain the right level of regulations that are in the environment. Now, what are the threats and what are some of the major areas that you've got to be concerned with? Well, of course, there's organized criminals that are out there. The guys who are accepting bitcoins and things. You've got your hacktivist groups, anonymous, that want to make a name for themselves. You've got nation states, right, that actually want to cause some type of definition of character to maybe it's a political party, have a military advantage, gain some type of competitive intellectual property. You know, the new Boeing jet engines or the new fighter jets that the U.S. government is going to release. You've got competitors that are more and more hiring actually individuals, especially for other nation states, where they're actually planting them inside of organizations. They pay them to be in your organization as an insider, where they gain information and they garner your trust over a period of time. And then you've got the aspect of internal and external people that are good-natured, but they pivot at some point, right? They decide to take another opportunity, a new job, and their intentions change. So if you think about Eric Snowden as an example, right? He was a contractor for Dell for a period of time. He was asked to leave as a contractor for Dell because they saw actually suspicious activity from a behavioral analysis perspective. But they didn't have the right third-party risk controls in place to keep them from joining another organization. That's where he actually gained access to the information, and then eventually went to Hawaii and shared it. And his parents were also part of different three-letter agencies working for them over a course of period of time. So it really started, if you think about it, it starts to change. Well, who do we consider an insider? And what are the actual threat patterns that are part of that insider? When is the turning point that that person no longer becomes somebody that is a trusted workforce member and now becomes somebody that you have to worry about? What are the key indicators that you should look at? What type of reconnaissance are they going to be doing? What's the packaging of the data that they're going to take? How are they going to take that data, and then how are they going to resurrect that later on? So that's an insider threat pattern. How do you start to look at that from an incident response perspective? Then you've got your typical DDoS threat patterns that are out there, where you do reconnaissance, you have a botnet, you test, and you attack. You try to flood either the external network or the internal network. Advanced threats, right? Reconnaissance, lure somebody to go to a website. Maybe you're doing phishing attempts against them. You create an exploit. One of the most recent ones I've seen is they will actually do a phishing attempt to segments of organizations at 100 people at a time. Every 10 minutes, they'll actually test 100 emails. It will send them to open up a web page that ends with star.hta, which is a help file for Internet Explorer, and it will launch a JavaScript. That JavaScript will open up a PowerShell command and dump Mimikatz. So you actually have all the pass the hash information. You can send it outbound to Command and Conquer. But that's an advanced threat. And how do you actually detect that with your normal malware and advanced malware solutions that are out there? PowerShell is something that you want most of your IT professionals to use because that's something that's available on all workstations. It's available in Windows. It helps you automate. So how do you take a different knack with that? And how do you know that that PowerShell is trusted? And then something that's new that's coming up in reality is cyber stalking, right? If I wanted to find out more information about an individual and I actually wanted to threaten them as an individual, you want to be able to do reconnaissance on that as somebody who's looking at this threat. Many times those individuals really aren't, they're oblivious to their surroundings. They're focused on a device, right? How many of us have cell phones, walk around with their head down, right? How many of us actually know who's looking around at our devices we're doing that? Not many. But what does that cell phone actually provide information to? I know mine when I look it up, right? I've got my 2 kids that are on there. Well, they immediately know I have 2 kids, right? It may have your name. It may have a device. What happens if you leave Bluetooth on or other beacons that are on that device? Typically, people that are doing cyber stalking, they're in observation mode for a period of time. They're looking at things like your company badge, right? Or a lanyard that may be around your neck that says Joe Green, right? Think about that from how many of our email addresses are joe.green@whateverdomain.com. And how much information you're giving away about your identity from that. And then you've got information mining. Now, the information mining could occur from things like white pages, LinkedIn. But those, and many times, they're exploiting just to have fun or to have some type of physical harm with the individual, right? They want to make them upset about something. That's where you get into the cyber stalking aspect of it. And many times today, more and more CEOs are actually falling victims to this because they're out in the community, but they're also doing business. So you have to worry about those aspects from a security perspective. Now, from the top 10 security threats, from a prioritization perspective, you've got to look at the aspect of, well, what are these different threat categories? What are the different threats actors that may be looking at this information? And what's the likelihood that that's actually going to occur? These are just an example of those from a threat priority assessment based. But every organization is going to be a little bit different. But these are good categories at least to start with and start to think about. Data exfiltration, malware, virus outbreaks, exploiting known security issues. Those are all different ways and a different way to look at those different threats that we mentioned earlier. But when we look at it overall, we can't stop it, right? How often can we stop this at the speed of a network or speed of a wire? It's pretty tough to do so. But if we can't stop it, that doesn't mean that we stop trying. We have to continue to try, but we also have to implement all the detective controls in nature so we can find it later on. So from an identity perspective, just like we were talking about from a threats, you've got different users. We started bridging the gap a little bit about what are some of the types of information that you care about, what are the different types of threats that you should worry about. But from an identity access management perspective, you've got different types of users that are there: internal, external, vendors, students, interns, residents, other, right? Different classes of people that may need access to your data or need access to your systems. Different relationships of those individuals to your organization. Then you've got different levels of infrastructure, applications, databases, servers. Those applications may be hosted in different environments. We talked a bit about infrastructure as a service, cloud as a service, software as a service, right? But also local inside of your data centers. The other key component is today, user directories are completely separate. Your HR systems maintain workforce members, but are your contractors in that same environment? Most likely not, because one is for sourcing procurement, the other one's for your HR team, right? Your full-time employees. When do those identities actually start to merge and cross-intersect each other so that you can actually aid your incident response team? And you've got identity, people are creating identity as a service, which basically means taking that information on both sides and collapsing it so that you have one clean data repository. And a lot of the vendors that are out there will actually sell you services of completing that. You've got identity management, that's a component, which really deals with access management, your access request, what type of authorization that they have, that an account was created, removed, update, disabled. You've got your access governance services that are out there in general with IAM, which is certifications, roles, governance, segregation of duties, logging, auditing, and reporting. Right? Remember incident response. You have to know exactly who has access to what and why they have access to that. It becomes a key core component of that. And then your authentic or access management services. And if we which is authentication, authorization, password management. But if we take a look at how does this stuff fit together, you have identity that gets created whenever you're created inside of an environment. You typically have some type of request, an event that gets generated, maybe HR's hired. You at that point get some type of access that is created, which provides you authentication. You get roles that are added to you that provide you some type of authorization. And then depending on what level of entitlement that you have, that account may need to be locked up in a privilege management solution that you see up there in 8. And then a part of the overall control and governance space, you need to have an extract of all the entitlements. You have to do your certification transfer mechanisms, and then access evaluation and reconciliation, so that eventually you know exactly what access to remove and to who you need to remove it from when somebody leaves the organization. But from an incident response perspective, we've got to make sure that we defend against every adversary at all the time. And if they continue to know more about your environment and have a longer period of dwell time inside your environment than what you have the ability to actually spend time on it, then they're always going to win. So how do you start to gather that information? Most of the time, or at least what we've seen from a 2015 Verizon report, was the case of 60% of the cases the attackers were able to compromise organizations within minutes. Think about it. Your cell phone is connected to a wireless network at work. Your computer is connected to those same environments. How are they getting in? Well, a lot of times it's from phishing, right? Which its endpoint is your device, which is on the wireless network, which has some type of identity of you, which has some type of authorization, which may or may not have privilege into your workstation, or may not have privilege across other devices and server infrastructure in your space. What even makes it more complex is many times that access may be what you have in a cloud environment, and maybe what you have in Office 365 and Amazon Azure. And as a part of that, what that typically also means is that pivoting point of their OODA loop is actually within 24 hours. The first victim gets infected or gets compromised, and within 24 hours, the next box is. So how do you stay up to date fast enough whenever you know that the access and where they have access to is going to change within 24 hours? You're going to continually be chasing your tail if you're only looking at this on a periodic basis. And if you don't understand what the privileges are that the attacker may have on your behalf. So in this case, especially from a phishing perspective, time isn't really on our side, right? 50% of users open email and click on phishing links within the first hour that you receive it. That's industry standard that's been out there. Median time to actually click is 1:22 seconds. Within 1:22 seconds, 50% of the people that you get out of that 100-person burst is actually going to click on the link. And the majority of those don't have CVEs that are published at this point, which means they're going to own your host before you're aware of it, because the CVEs are one of the things that vulnerability scanners and other things actually pick up on. So how are you going to actually continue to monitor that and understand it? So what we've typically seen, and again, the time isn't really on your side from this perspective, right? The amount of dwell time that organizations go through is a continuous loop. But if you haven't detected some type of compromise in the last 6 months, it's not because it's not happening. It's because you're not looking in the right areas. You don't have the right log files. You don't have the right detection in place. Many organizations are falling short on the aspect of actually having net flow traffic, as an example, going into their SIM, of having sticks and DSTIG and taxi threat intel of actually going back into your SIM to provide additional threat intelligence in that space. But every one of those platforms that we've been deploying over time typically have some type of APIs and controls that are in place. And that's the only way we're going to start as an industry, start to bridge the gap and get in front of this. Now, from a threat and incident analysis perspective, this is, for the most part, the approach that we take, right? We have a threat or an incident that occurs. Some type of threat analyst starts to look at it, acknowledges it, the review in your SOC, right? Determines if that alert is something that we need to investigate. And depending on that, the alert level changes from event to an incident. And then you start looking at your threat intelligence feed, cross-client analysis, and then look at your partner and industry that's out there to see if that's actually something that's been known for in the past. You look at investigation, results, root cause, but think about how much time this is taking from the OODA loop, right? They're going to continue, the attacker and the person who's causing a threat against your organization is going to continue to pivot through your environment. So how do you start to bridge that? And the only way you really can is start to move more towards an automated response for that. Actually leveraging those same data structures that we talked about earlier to pull that information together into consolidated platforms so your SOC analyst can make educated decisions. So this is actually a scenario that we've seen a couple different times with different clients to think about. And it will build out. But the very first thing that they do is they compromise some type of captured credentials. Now, think about that for a second, right? As they're capturing those credentials, they now have identity of somebody. They know most likely your login ID pattern of how your user ID is actually constructed. They have authorization inside your environment from clicking that phishing link, right? They have some type of authentication to the host. And depending if you've actually locked down the workstation, they may actually have an entire data dump of your credentials. Now, if they don't have access to it, most of the time they still can run things like Mimikatz to actually do a pass the hash exercise against it. They then leverage those same credentials that they just compromised that host with to get inside. They can look at external facing applications. And then they can start to escalate privileges and start to move laterally. At that point, how many organizations actually have the ability to look at or decrypt SSL traffic going outbound? The majority of organizations even today, even though the technology exists, they're not actually looking at that because they fear of some other regulatory and compliance issue. No matter if it's PCI or HIPAA, and what happens if that cryptographic SSL cert is then used for harm versus good. And what that is allowing them to do then as attackers and threat actors are then able to take advantage of that and send that information outbound, unbeknownst to you from a data loss prevention perspective. So when you think about this, look at every component that deals with identity access management, right? They're capturing the credentials. Well, there's your access. There's your identity. You have the credentials to get inside. Well, now you have the authorization. You've escalate privileges. Oh, well, there's your privilege management solution. And you have some type of lateral movement that's in there. Well, that means there's not the right separation of duty of your infrastructure inside that environment. Now, from that same scenario, we were able to run a few things that are pretty enticing and interesting, right? Most people think that they can compromise an environment by leveraging badges, right? Gaining physical access to it. But it's not just about gaining physical access. You can do it remotely over the wire. You can do it via wireless traffic. But here are a few examples of different recon utilities that you can actually leverage and what we're seeing inside of the incident response space. So we're seeing people run command.exe, spawn a shell, right? Run PowerShell scripts to actually run Mimikatz or WCE. Schedule that as a task to talk outbound through a command and control conquer, and then leverage WMI to validate that the host is up and running or not. Now, every one of those components needs some type of privilege management. Again, it ties it back. And you have to know who's the authentication aspect of it, who owns that service account, who owns that individual account, to actually be able to track down and validate that there's no additional dwell time inside the organization. Other things that may be leveraged during a recon stage is who am I, understanding net view and the domain, your net users, looking at open ports, net files, net sessions. And primarily, if you look at CryptoLocker and ransomware, they're using net session and net file. They're wanting to understand, well, what file shares are actually actively available, and then they're locking those behind cryptoware. Why? Because then they can make you pay via Bitcoin in some other industry, and you don't have any repercussions. The same tools that are used for remote execution in that environment are the same things that our IT teams are going to leverage, right? Think about scheduled task. Is at.exe. How are you going to be able to determine that from a SIM and logging perspective? A lot of your server personnel and IT personnel are going to be leveraging that. They're going to be starting tasks and scheduling those. WMI, again, they're going to want to know if your servers are up or down, operational. PowerShell, they typically import users, create mailboxes, check diagnostic of machines, patch workstations, all leveraging PowerShell. RDP, same thing. Your service desk is probably leveraging that off and on. And then there's third-party tools, which sysinternals, I guess you could consider that third-party, but it's really Microsoft, right? Where you've got PS exec and you can spawn other processes and services. But all those take some type of privilege inside of the environment. Now, from a SIM perspective, some of the things that you should potentially look for from an incident response, look at the number of these that are actually identity access management related that you would want to actually validate and verify inside your SIM to be able to detect some type of dwell time or pivot and compromise. If you're looking for these, you at least have good indicators that something is going wrong inside of your environment, right? Identifying alerts around account lockouts, establishing event IDs around adding users to privileged groups, right? Your domain admins group, your built-in administrators group, other things. Those are great ways to actually be able to pick that up without having a preventative control in place. You can have that detective area there. Security group enablement modification, changing the purpose of group. Successful user account login. If your domain admin or administrator's password or schema admin password, user ID all of a sudden is used, and that's not something that's normally used in your environment, establish a rule and log that will actually alert you to that. Failed user login attempt, account login with explicit credentials. Those are all different account usages, and from an IAM framework, right, things that can lead you to that indicator of compromise that allow you to start looking at things from an incident response perspective. Now, there's other items there as well. Interactive logins, network logons, batch, service, and unlocks. Those are, again, other event types that you can consider. From an interactive login perspective, in most cases, organizations are at least encrypting some type of information as it goes across the wire. But you probably want to be alerted to the fact if there's an event of an interactive login where it's sending the network credentials in clear text across the wire. That's probably something you should look at. It's, again, indicator that something's gone wrong. Network logins to printers or folders, depending on what it is. So when you look at this from an overall perspective, and you get your IAM team communicating across the different silos with your incident response, you can actually start to pick up some of those key characteristics of events that you need to worry about. You can start looking at the threats and the actors that are out there, and then you can reduce your overall risk posture in that environment. Because your reputation, loss of intellectual property, and operations area are what the impacts of a breach are. And you've got to be concerned with that from a information security, a compliance, regulatory, and audit perspective. And it doesn't matter what industry or vertical that you're in. We're here to establish and make the business grow, right? If the business doesn't continue to grow, they're not going to continue investing in information security and risk management. So what have we learned, right? And how do we actually apply some of this? Number one, if you're worried about cyber stalking and cyber bullying, right, for you individually, personally, go to the DMA.org, right? It will at least remove your personal information out from the web. Now, it's going to be temporary because every day people are actually posting and harvesting more information, but that at least gets your name out of the public light. I'd encourage you to do it not for you just yourself, but also for your children, right? That's one way to start knocking down that threat vector. Enable sufficient logging, right? We talked about some of the event viewer logs that we need to consider. If we do that, we'll have a better indicators of pivots and indicators of compromise. Understand really what your threat model is. What is the threat to your business? What is the threat to the processes of your organization or the people themselves? In the first 3 months, right, perform some type of indicator of pivot hunting on your actual endpoints. Look at it from an enterprise disaster recovery perspective and solutioning. Everybody has Microsoft Event Viewer logs at minimum. Many of us have some type of SIM solution. Everything that was shown here was in Microsoft Event Viewer logs. You should be able to start to leverage some of those pretty easily. Role play through different scenarios, right? It's a way that you can actually start to harvest information about your organization, lack of process, lack of understanding from the people perspective, and start to understand your technology more than you do today. Implement some type of virtual directory. And you may ask, well, why is that important? We talked a little bit about the beginning about identity access management, and the fact is that you've got people who are doing business on your behalf that you aren't aware of. And how do you actually continue to maintain and know about that? How do you look at that from a behavioral analysis perspective to know that they are no longer a friendly insider, but now they're an insider that I need to worry because they're going to another organization, they're going to another company. In that case, in those virtual directories, typically you're also storing information about social media presence, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. Why? Well, if all of a sudden you've got a high-value, trusted employee in your organization and they are connecting out to a lot of recruiters or other HR personnel, that may be a reason that you need to take additional monitoring steps on their actual workstation and their device. Right? You may have additional auditing and logging of alerts that you want to look at. You may be wanting to look at patterns of exfiltration of data. Validate that all terminated users are actually removed from your environment. Right? We talked about that from a GRC perspective and a certification perspective, but I will guarantee you that you've got individuals inside your environment that either you don't know what the service or the functional account is, that person had that has now left the organization and there's no owner of that, or that there's an individual that has access to your environment still after they've left. And if you look at their last login date, and if it's after their term date, be worried, right? Start to look at that. That's another key indicator if you think about it from your event viewer perspective. There's a last login date event type that's there. Match that together. Within 6 months, implement enhanced authentication for domain accounts. Put some type of pass the hash mitigating controls in place. Those typically can be event viewer steps, right? But there are specific events that tell you if pass the hash has been successful or failed. Those are things that you actually want to look at, because knowing that it failed is just important as knowing if it was successful. Design and enhance your incident response capabilities. The email flow back and forth and chain of custody in the court of law, that's horrible. Your entire email system is going to get caught up. Make sure that on every one of your emails, if you are using email or any reports, that you put that it's client privileged information, right, or attorney client privileged information, and that you're doing it on behalf of the attorney. Otherwise, they can continue to subpoena that information. And certify users access not just to the infrastructure environments, but actually to your applications as well, and the access that it has. Many individuals transfer within inside organizations, hospital systems, financial institutions, other environments. And one of the things that continue to go on is the bloat of authorization across the board. And when one of those users get compromised, now they have a bloat of authorization that they now have access to. And it's a way that you can continue to ratchet down the amount of damage that can occur from a reputation perspective. So what you're really trying to do is get these different tools, get the processes actually integrating together. This is more of a modern day, right, ER room where you've got different components and systems that are working together. You're limiting the number of physicians that are actually in the room. But part of it's because they're sharing information. There's integration in between the different technologies and solutions that are there. The medical devices equipment are actually sending information back and forth. You want to be able to get to that same estate from your information security and your risk management and your threat analytics and your incident response and IAM perspective. And it does take time, but every one of those solutions and vendors have some type of API that are available out to it. So leverage those. Leverage those actually to automate that incident response. Leverage those to gain additional information about those indicators of compromise or those indicators of some type of pivot in your environment. And if you start to do that, you're going to gain better visibility about that environment, and you'll actually understand the asset estate about your environment better than IT does, which actually makes you the first person that they call when something happens versus being afraid to make the phone call. So that's it. I'll kind of open it up for questions. Here's a few references, but. I believe so. It's been a conversation so far because there's certain slides that we were going to make available and some of them that we weren't. All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great conference.